Propaganda is the usage of information, which is often misleading or biased, to promote or support a political cause or belief. The American legacy was born from the Revolutionary War inferno and raised from the ashes of British colonialism. Therefore, we as Americans have always romanticized war and have rallied to protect our interests in democracy and freedom.
Throughout the 20th century, there were 4 major wars that shaped modern-day America: World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. In this video, we will dive into the propaganda used to mobilize a nation into battle. As technology advanced, more unique forms could be made, from sensational journalism to elusive video.
Propaganda was used in World War I just like any other war. The main purpose of propaganda was to ensure that people would only learn what the government wanted them to learn. Through the use of propaganda, the government controlled all forms of information. The government expected the newspapers to print only what they approved. The Committee on Public Information was a government propaganda body whose purpose was to mobilize public support for the United States' participation in World War I. The generously funded organization served the purpose that radios and television would today. The CPI's goal was to make sure that these citizens' loyalty to the United States stayed strong.
Created by the executive order of President Woodrow Wilson in 1917 and approved by Congress, the CPI was in charge of staging a national campaign to encourage service in the military and the purchase of war bonds to fuel the massive military effort. Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford made frequent appearances at the meetings to help inspire patriotic fervor, but the CPI's 4 Minutemen performed the bulk of the work. These were 75,000 speakers who delivered short, patriotic encouragements at local churches, at cinemas during intermission, and at schools and other public buildings. World War II was notorious for its use of propaganda. It called all and every American to rise up and help the war effort. Propaganda was also enforced using a new piece of technology, the video camera. Before featured presentations were presented in movie theaters. Oftentimes a short film was presented on the war effort. One of the most famous World War II posters, and probably even the most famous propaganda piece of all time, was Rosie the Riveter. Before the war, women were not expected to hold a job, let alone a hard-working industrial job. However, Rosie broke the stereotype and encouraged women to take on harder jobs such as producing cars, ships, airplanes, and steel. Rosie's representation in magazines and posters sent thousands of women to work, and thousands more enlisted in the Women's Army Corps, or WAC. Presented here is some pro-WAC propaganda titled, "Ladies, It's Your War Too."
Hey, there goes one of those petticoat soldiers now.
Yeah. My sister wants to join the WACs. What do you think of that?
She's crazy. What the devil's a woman want to be a soldier for?
Just a waste of time. This is a man's war. What sort of jobs can they do?
What sort of jobs can we do? Take a look, mister. X-ray technicians, inspectors of Army meat, teachers schooling our soldiers, WACs are classification experts, assignment interviewers.
So this is a man's war, is it? WACs are at work on every sort of Army vehicle, doing every sort of motor transport job, testing walkie-talkies, testing radio tubes. Those are just a few of the jobs they do. There are 239 more. Hey, you 2 armchair generals on the porch, here's something more for you to think about. Listen.
General Eisenhower said, "In many jobs, WACs do the work of 2 men. The Army needs and can use all it can get."
And listen to the women of the United Nations. They, too, have some ideas on the subject. The English with their calm courage, the stalwart women of heroic Russia, the Canadian and Australian women, the women of China with their undying fortitude, and tens of thousands of American WACs. What are their ideas on the subject? Listen.
We shall live up to the legends of our fighting men.
did these thousands come from? Where will the United States Army get thousands more? Thousands to back up manpower for battle abroad. Who are the women who will help retain the needed manpower for the production battle at home? Who are the women who will help fight our country's war? It's Mary Jones, Jane Doe. It's the idle housewife and the girl next door. Oh yes, it's your war too, Miss and Mrs. America.
As you can see, women were desperately wanted for the war, and no stereotype could dismiss these powerful women. An important power about propaganda is that it can blind an entire nation from cruelty because it can be shown in a different light or be extremely misleading. An important example is the Japanese encampment, which occurred after the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. Due to Japan's horrifying attack on December 7, 1941, the U.S. government decided to incarcerate more than 110,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent, regardless of citizenship, due to fear of espionage on the West Coast. Take a look at the short film created by the U.S. government to explain the Japanese encampment.
Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began.
As you can see, this picturesque film was the perfect solution to explain the treatment of Japanese Americans. However, this movie does not show the true story of Japanese encampment. First, the assembly centers were hastily converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Many families found themselves living in horse stalls. Secondly, they were transferred to internment camps built farther inland in remote deserts that experienced extreme weather conditions such as scorching days, freezing nights, and blinding sandstorms. The incarceration continued until 1943, and very few Americans knew of it until many years later. The next major wars were fought to protect the American brand of democracy and freedom. Korea at the time was a power struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. However, once China's stance on America changed negatively and North Korea invaded the democratic South, we were once again caught and dragged into war.
Propaganda was not unique to the Korean War, but the use of propaganda was brought to a new level in Korea. Most leaflets were dropped from aircraft. They were printed on low-quality paper in one or two colors. Leaflets were a form of psychological warfare in which flyers were scattered in the air. These leaflets had different purposes and targets. Those aimed at soldiers often encouraged surrender to avoid death from fighting UN forces. North Korean soldiers were promised that as prisoners of war they would experience the replacement of the hardships of war with food, medical treatment, warmth, and safety.
The Korean War would end in a ceasefire, which will later come back to haunt America later in future wars. Marking as one of the most traumatic periods in U.S. history, the Vietnam War spanned over a decade and caused disruption in Asia and the American home front. As the war progressed, unrest grew increasingly in America as Americans became uninterested and negative towards the war. Video footage was caught of horrifying moments that scared Americans watching back home on their televisions. The sheer length of the war also exhausted Americans financially as well as mentally. This took a turn as propaganda began to be produced by anti-war doves. Instead of the patriotic posters of the past, these posters demanded an end to the Vietnam War and villainized the U.S. government. The sharing and spreading of American information has proven to be imperative on the war front. By creating a patriotic state of mind, more citizens are willing to enlist, ration, and work even harder in order to win. By giving biased and misleading information, the nation can take on an air of righteousness and arrogance that can also aid in the war effort. Not only that, the propaganda has given America the vintage nostalgia of simpler times of American greatness.